For almost 20 years after World War II, American life felt, well, pretty unified. There was this broad consensus built on fighting communism and, a certain kind of domestic conformity. And then the 1960s hit. And that consensus didn't just crack, it absolutely shattered. This is the story of how that happened and how it was driven by the very kids who grew up in the prosperity their parents had built. And you can really see that dramatic shift, boom, right here. On one side, you've got the 1950s, a time defined by agreement, by everyone kind of being on the same page. On the other, the 1960s, just a total rupture, widespread rebellion. So the big question is, how on earth did we get from one to the other so fast? What triggered this massive cultural earthquake? Well, here's the crazy part, the real irony of the whole thing. The very stability and wealth that defined the 1950s, that's what created the perfect conditions for it all to be rejected. It gave a whole new generation the security, the education, and honestly, the time and space to look around and start asking, is this it? Is this all there is? So paradoxically, all that prosperity, it's what fueled the disillusionment. So if that prosperity was the kindling, just waiting for a spark, then the Vietnam War was the match that lit the whole thing on fire. For the youth of the 60s, this wasn't some abstract foreign policy debate. No, this became a direct, personal, and life-altering fight. And why was it so personal? One word: the draft. See, conscription meant the war wasn't just some headline happening on the other side of the world. For millions of young American men, it was a constant, looming threat that hung over their heads. It forced them to confront the morality of the war because their own lives were literally on the line. And at the exact same time, you've got this brand new technology that was a total game changer: television. For the very first time, unfiltered, graphic images from the battlefield, the combat, the suffering, were being beamed directly into American living rooms every single night. This just blew the lid off the government's official story, fueling this massive wave of skepticism and outrage. 4. That's how many college students were killed by the National Guard at Kent State University in 1970. Think about that. The stakes of protesting became tragically, horrifyingly high. Those shootings sent a shockwave across the entire country. It was this awful moment that proved that dissent wasn't just some political act anymore. It could be a matter of life and death, right there on a college campus. And you had these incredibly powerful voices personifying the moral opposition to the war. When Muhammad Ali, maybe the most famous person on the planet at the time, refused the draft, he risked his entire career, everything. And his words were like a lightning bolt, connecting the violence of the war overseas to the fight for racial justice right here at home. It forced America to look at the deep, deep moral contradictions of the whole conflict. But you see, Ali's stand wasn't just this raw emotional thing. It was a deep philosophical rejection of the way things were. And it got a lot of people thinking. If the system could be so profoundly wrong about Vietnam, well, what else was it wrong about? All this searching for answers, it gave birth to the political wing of the movement, the New Left. This was the intellectual engine that took all that anger and outrage over Vietnam and expanded it into a full-blown radical critique of American power, corporations, and social inequality. And the core idea, the real beating heart of the New Left, especially for the group Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, was this concept of participatory democracy. It was basically a rejection of this distant, impersonal government. They were arguing that real democracy wasn't just about pulling a lever in a voting booth every few years. It was about people having a direct say and real power over the things that shaped their daily lives. But here's something that's so important to remember. The youth of the 60s were not all on the same page, not even close. You can see the divide right here. While a group like SDS saw the war as imperialism and was pushing for radical social change, their conservative counterparts, the Young Americans for Freedom, or YAF, saw it as an absolutely essential fight against communism and stood for traditional values. The 1960s was a battle of ideas among the young, not just one single movement. So if the New Left was the political brain of this whole youth movement, then the counterculture, well, that was its heart, its soul. This was the lifestyle rebellion, a full-throated, deeply felt rejection of the entire world their parents had so carefully built for them. And they kind of had their own playbook, It was all about consciously choosing to step outside of what they saw as this rigid, corporate, consumer-driven America. That meant rejecting materialism, the whole two-car garage dream. It meant championing personal and sexual freedom, experimenting with new ways of living, and maybe most of all, using music not just as entertainment, but as the soundtrack, the unifying message of the revolution. And you can really track how this whole vibe just grew and took shape over the decade. In the early 60s, you hear it in the sharp critiques of folk music from people like Bob Dylan. By the mid-60s, it has a physical home, an epicenter in places like Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And then in '69, you get Woodstock. And that festival, wow, that was the moment everyone realized just how massive this desire for something different had become. So, okay, the long hair and the flower power, a lot of that eventually faded away, but the impact of that cultural shift, mixed with the political fire of the New Left, that didn't go anywhere. It fundamentally and permanently reshaped the American landscape. So, what did it leave behind? This is the new reality the '60s left us with. First, that old post-war consensus, gone, shattered for good. Second, questioning authority, that went from being a radical act to just a normal part of public life. Third, a deep skepticism of big institutions, like the government and corporations, became totally ingrained in the American mindset. And finally, a whole new model for activism was born, one that connected the dots between civil rights, feminism, peace, and all sorts of social justice movements. Think about it. The living room war was so powerful because for the first time, people were seeing these unfiltered images. Well, today we are all walking around with high-definition cameras in our pockets. Every single event is documented and it can be shared with the entire world instantly. So it really makes you wonder, in the world we live in now, is it even possible for authority to ever regain the kind of unquestioned trust it had before the 1960s?